Welcome to another episode of Oh, What a Lovely Podcast, where popular culture meets the First World War. I'm Angus Wallace, and with me, as ever, are Jessica Meyer and Chris Kempshall. And with us today is Jane Potter. Jane is a reader at Oxford Brookes University. I'm right to say your latest book, when we're recording this in July 2023, your latest book is literally just out, isn't it, Jane?
It's the new selected Letters of Wilfred Owen, and that's coming out supposedly on the 10th of August.
As we record, this is prime for pushing the book. So in this episode, we're going to be discussing the 2021 film Benediction, directed by Terence Davies. Benediction follows the life of British war poet Siegfried Sasson from the First World War through to the what I thought was the 1950s, but it could be the 1960s. It's slightly ambiguous. The film starts with Sassoon, played by Jack Lowden, being sent to the military hospital at Craig Lockhart after writing his letter, finished with the war, a soldier's declaration, which was sent to the press and read out in the House of Commons. At Craig Lockhart, Sassoon meets Wilfred Owen. The film then moves to look at Sassoon's love affairs in the 1920s and 30s, which included Ivan Novello, played by Jeremy Irvine. The film skips along as a series of flashbacks from a much older Sassoon, played by Peter Capaldi, and these are mixed with archive footage of the First World War. The closing scene has Capaldi's Sassoon sitting on a bench as Wilfred Owen's poem Disabled is read, which flashes back to a First World War amputee in his wheelchair. The LA Times believed these final moments were particularly devastating in the way that they bring home Sassoon's haunting memories of love and war and his first-hand knowledge of the destructive power of both. The Guardian described Benediction as bleak and often hard to watch, though it gave it 4 out of 5 stars. The film is funded, or was funded, by a partnership which included the BBC and the British Film Institute. It had a tiny budget of just £5 million. Everyone must have been working for free. Wikipedia tells me the film earned less than $900,000, so not a great return on investment. Jane, welcome. It's lovely to have you with us. I wonder if you want to start by sharing where your research interacts with Benediction, which either had you jumping for joy or your head in your hands.
It was kind of both. I found myself thinking about this quite a lot. I saw it first in the cinema and then rewatched it because it's recently come up on Netflix. So it was interesting to watch it twice. I mean, it intersects because I work on Owen and have, been kind of living with his letters for a long time and getting a sense of him through the letters. So it was interesting to see how he was interpreted by Davies in this. And I did keep sort of coming back to having seen Regeneration all those years ago. And it would be good to rewatch that, which I haven't had a chance to do, to kind of see those two sorts of interpretations of Craig Lockhart. I found at times sort of frustrating. And I think you mentioned this when you talked about In Memoriam for the last podcast, that, as historians and scholars of the original material, it's really difficult to sort of separate yourself and not see all of the kind of either sort of borrowings, as it were, and the inconsistencies and the tropes and all of this. And I think that's what I kept coming back to. My first impression was really to think about Rivers would have worn a uniform. He was in the RAMC as a captain. So he would not have been in what looked like morning dress. I don't think Sassoon was allowed to salute without being covered when he walked into the room. I thought that was very odd. Military historians can correct me on that one. There weren't soldiers or enlisted men at Craig Lockhart. They were all officers. So there were little things like this and also Robbie Ross was dead by October 1918, and Owen mentions this in one of his last letters to Sassoon. Sorry to hear about Robert Ross. As much as I love Simon Russell Beale, they managed to sort of resurrect Robbie Ross well into the 1920s, which was quite a comeback, really. So there were things like that I sort of went, oh gosh, but there were other bits that I even rewatching it, I think that the readings of the poems were beautiful. Jack Lowden did a beautiful job on those. And I do think that last scene of the reading of Disabled and the vignette of the soldier, although he had 2 arms, and I don't think he really does in the poem. I think he's also a multiply amputee in that. nevertheless, I thought that was quite moving. And I did actually show that to my students at one point. Somebody brought up the poem or had asked me what my favorite Owen poem was. And I said that was a particularly good rendering. So I thought that was very sensitively done, but I just couldn't get past some of the poetic license that was being taken, for instance. And as a sort of, raised a Catholic, although probably fairly lapsed, one does not prostrate oneself when one is baptized. That's only for a priest or nun taking final vows. So I see why it was done for dramatic effect and the symbolism, but yeah. So that was kind of, I'm a bit sort of, I liked bits of it, but as a film, I don't really feel it. It didn't do much for me, I suppose. I felt curiously unmoved by it, except for that reading of Disabled, I have to say.
First of all, I switched it off halfway through. I got partway through the love affairs, and I couldn't stand the rendition of Novello.
Indeed, was he that awful? I mean, I didn't realize.
But I kept thinking, this is Novello channeling Noel Coward's Nicky from The Vortex. And then they mentioned Noel Coward coming to see Sassoon in hospital. The timeline confused me utterly, because 1917 is when Novello meets his life partner, and yes, the affairs are historically accurate, but I couldn't suspend my disbelief enough to believe in that characterization of Novello, and that was when I switched off. But yeah, the Robbie Ross resurrection, I can't get to grips with the timeline here.
It's partly because I think that there was no cues to tell you quite where you were. So I thought we were still watching the war, and then he says, "Oh, shall we dance?" And then they do the Charleston, and I think the Charleston's post-war. What's going on? Where? And it had me reaching for my phone to check when the Charleston was came out, 1923. Oh, we're beyond the war. Oh, okay. And then I hadn't realised we'd skipped forward at another point, and I'm watching it, and suddenly there's a reference to the Hitler Youth, and I thought, oh, we've jumped forward in time again. Oh, where are we now?
I meant to look up, when was that formed? That sounds terrible that I don't know that, but I mean, wasn't that sort of in the 30s rather than the 1920s? And there was a scene where he flashes back to Sassoon in hospital, and Ross comes to visit him, and that didn't make any sense at all.
Well, that thing in hospital is framed as, the wound he got when he got back. But he's in hospital, he's shown with his arm in a sling. And when he got wounded, he was shot in the head.
And he definitely met Othlin Morel before he throws his medal in the canal.
Exactly. Not it made it look like it was post-war, and he knew he was at Garsington. There was a plan to try and get Owen to Garsington, and he doesn't make it. He says that in one of his letters. And also, it's not Ross that gets him to Craiglockhart and influences the board. It's Robert Graves. And where is Robert Graves in this? I kept wondering, because he's actually the one that says, I think it's Adeline and her folks that have encouraged you into this action, which ultimately gets him sent there. And it's Graves that orchestrates, getting assigned to Craiglockhart for neurasthenia rather than being court-martialed. So that was all strange.
He doesn't go back to the war in it either, does he? It's sort of, the war sort of finishes for him there, where he did actually return to France and I think the Middle East, didn't he, after that?
That's where he's made captain later, is in the Middle East.
Kind of conveniently overlooked, because it breaks the kind of anti-war narrative that's sort of being spun.
Absolutely. It loses out the whole year of Owen's life. They didn't part from each other at Craiglockhart. I mean, I thought that leave taking was sensitively done. And they didn't try and create a sort of physical relationship between the two of them, but they hinted at it. And the sort of swimming thing. I mean, I got the whole, as an English person, you read into all the sorts of imagery and metaphors, and there's a bit of Rupert Brooke in that with soldiers, swimming, and there's almost a David Hockney version in there too.
There is some wonderful vignettes. The swimming and the leaving scene are absolutely superb.
Yeah, I think the leaving scene did portray that sort of what probably was an acknowledgement between them, but an awkwardness as well. I think, we don't know exactly what that leave taking was like. So as an imaginative thing, I thought that was sensitively done, but it didn't happen at Craiglockhart. Owen meets people in London as a result of Sassoon. They leave each other in London. It's just a little more complex than that. And I thought that would have been interesting to see how that gets interpreted, because there's a lot of details in Owen's letters, certainly about what that last year was like.
Can we just talk about soldiers dancing? Talking about the physical relationship between Owen and Sassoon. That was where I started getting really quite irritated, because this idea that two men dancing would have been interpreted that way at that time is just not historically accurate. There's a lot of men dancing. There's a lot of men dancing in drag. We have seen a lot of this. We've talked about this on this podcast.
It keeps coming up. British men in drag.
I'm tempted sometimes to rename this podcast as British soldiers dancing after the Soviet soldiers dancing Twitter account. But, that just... Really?
There was a sledgehammer aspect to the trying to get some, they were really doing something really out there, and that to have, God bless him, Julian Sands, but that just would not have happened. It's just not possible.
I mean, I'm sure there were men dancing the tango at Craiglockhart together, but I don't think it would have sparked that reaction from the authorities. Or I'm not sure they were dancing the tango.
I mean, we know Owen was involved in theatricals because he talks about it. I don't think Sassoon was. I think he was far too above all of that.
Well, they did what everyone does, which is just overlook AJ Brock.
Indeed. Oh, well, yes. I know. Completely.
I think it's terribly sad. poor Dr.
He really
Brock.
gets short shrift, doesn't he? Yeah.
He does. And the whole sort of concept of ergotherapy and the idea of using the Hydra as rehabilitation. Oh, all the farm work that got done at Craiglockhart, however badly by these middle-class men.
Owen goes out and teaches in the school, and he meets all sorts of arty people in Craiglockhart. It's not, his experience at Craiglockhart was not confined to Sassoon or to the hospital. He lived a lot in those.
And Sassoon's was not confined to Rivers and Owen either, as far as I know.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, and Graves comes to visit them, so I thought the lack of having Robert Graves in there as anything was very strange.
It's a notable absence.
It was hugely notable. And it's really Graves that comments on disabled, and tells him in a letter, you really have something.
There is a credit for Graves in the cast list. Who is it? Because I looked that up and wondered if that turned up later in the bit that I didn't watch. But apparently not.
I don't remember seeing Graves.
Hang on a sec. Let me pull up the cast list.
But if Robert Graves is appearing in it, he's not appearing in it where you would expect him to appear.
Jonathan Broadbent plays Robert Graves.
Oh, well, I'll have to go and look for him then.
Have to say, his face doesn't look familiar from the film, but there you go.
Yeah.
I guess he had Robert Ross in there to push the Wilde connection or the queer connection, I suppose, if you but even that's just sort of tripped off the tongue very briefly in the party. And I think if you didn't know about that, you wouldn't make that leap.
I think there's a lot of knowledge that the viewer has to have in some respect to make some of these leaps to understand the film, like about the Charleston, like the throwaway remark about Hitler. Otherwise, you're not quite completely not sure what's going on.
But what's very odd is there's this assumed if they're assuming that the audience has that knowledge, then the audience that has that knowledge is also going to have the knowledge about Robert Gray, about the First World War history of this. This is not an unknown history, not least because of people like Jane who write about it so well.
There's an element of the film where they are, or at the very least kind of the script writers or the screenwriters are very keen on leaving kind of breadcrumbs about how clever and how well read they are, or that we've read these biographies about Sassoon, because in John Stewart Roberts' biography about Sassoon, he describes Ivor Novello as basically being a man who collected lovers as he collected lilacs. And there's a line in the film where somebody asks Novello, "Are you still collecting lilacs?" To basically look, they might want to stand on the screen and hold up the book, go, "Look, we read this." There's various bits in there where they're trying to show how how coward-esque they are at times as well with the witticism.
We'll Gather Lilacs is an Ivor Novello song, of course.
I studied To His Coy Mistress at GCSE or A-level, and basically the only thing I remember from that film is the part where they talk about her quaint honour, and quaint doesn't mean what we think it means. It means something very, very, very different. And at one point in the film, Ivor Novello rather cattily says to somebody that you've always had a quaint sense of humour, or something along those lines. And they leave these little literary gag Easter eggs in there to show how clever they are, which is really distracting.
Or also to suggest that, to the audience watching it, oh, I'm clever because I get that clever bit, And so there was this odd, for me, kind of a knowingness about it and appealing to people who know the area, and at the same time still playing on all the tropes, the sort of films, interspersing that, they are still doing all of the kinds of, when he had the sort of cattle song at that, in the initial phase, I was like,
Ghost Riders in the Sky.
Oh, goodness, yeah.
Did you just expect Rowdy Yates to be on next singing Rawhide? It's very, very jarring. So they've been flashing back to these First World War archival footage, and then there's cows in the American prairies with Ghost Riders in the Sky, sort of a cowboy song.
And then straight into Anthem for Doomed Youth.
It's just bizarre. And apparently Terence Davies says, I whilst making the film, I remembered we had a chap who used to visit the family and used to sing that song, and it came to me and I put it in. It makes no sense. I mean, if you're trying to draw sort of the metaphors, lambs to the slaughter.
Well, it's what Possum Bells for These Who Die as Cattle. It's that obvious.
It's a sledgehammer. I think there was a lot of sledgehammer stuff in it, and you just think the same kind of, I know it's coming now.
There was a reference to Oh, What a Lovely War there, because it was sort of framed as a music hall, and of course, there had been the westerns touring, the Buffalo Bill touring pre-war, so you can sort of see where that's going, but yeah, it didn't quite work somehow.
It doesn't fit. Certainly not the sort of aristocratic nature of the social circle that these people are moving, and then suddenly to go into a 1940s Western song it was jarring. It was just peculiar.
Well, what I found odd, well, speaking of sort of that kind of jarringness, is when I don't think Sassoon lived in a sort of 30 semi. I think he was at Heytesbury, which was quite a big house, really. So that kind of put me off. I went, when did he move to the burbs? Just
suburban Sassoon, really?
And we get another dreadful Aldington-esque mother. I'm going to start collecting these.
Although I have to say, and there were caricatures, but I mean, I did like the Sitwell bit. I thought she was fabulous, actually.
She was so good. That was just like listening to one of her poems come to life. It was amazing.
It was. And the look, I mean, they really got the sort of look of her, and I thought that was probably one of my favorite parts.
Yeah. No, I really liked Leah Williams as Edith Sitwell. I thought that was fantastic.
That was superb. That was where I went, oh yeah, you've done that well.
And I studied Sitwell as an undergraduate, and that was sort of a complete throwback to reading her poetry.
But again, I just, you can't do everything in that, in a film. And I think to some extent you have to, again, take poetic license and cut things down. But, they had a really interesting relationship, Sitwell and Sassoon. Sassoon wasn't just, oh, Edith, yes, of course. There's this sort of, condescension that he has. And of course they kind of fall out over sort of modernism and way they were taking things. But, she edits Owen, and in fact says, in a letter, he's kind of left me to do all of this.
I hadn't realized she was involved with the editing.
The very first edition. Well, she gets Owen's poems through Osbert to Owen's main poems first appear in Wheels in 1918, which is dedicated to him. And then she's really does all the donkey work on the 1920 edition. So Sassoon does the introduction, but he leaves her to sort it out. And she says in the letter, I'm really a bit cross because Captain Sassoon has gone off to America and left me to do the rest of it. So there is quite a complex, I mean, you can't do that in this film. That's not what it's about. But I think it is interesting for viewers to know, listeners of the podcast to know that their relationship and Sitwell as an editor, not just as a sort of quite flamboyant, which she was, personality, but actually did a lot of the sort of grunt work of editing. And she writes very moving letters to Owen's mother, Susan, in trying to get the manuscripts. So there's as in anything, I think there's more to the personality that comes through in the film.
There's a tendency at times, and again, whether the film is trying to do too much and failing or just breezing over bits and pieces. I mean, one of the thing I was about to talk about was the use of archival footage and the like that they just sprinkle in with no context. It's very much like some of the problems Alice Kelly had with We Shall Not Grow Old, or They Shall Not Grow Old, rather, where it's just like, here's a battle scene with some stuff. No context. It's just here to make you feel unpleasant and feel bad.
I thought about that. That's exactly what it recalled. Yeah.
Well, there was at least one where it was quite clearly trying to portray it as Sassoon having a flashback, a shell shock flashback, which made me uncomfortable because the narrative around his shell shock is so complex in terms of what it actually might have been as. There's a lot of very genuine protest in there, and he may or may not have been shell-shocked, but he certainly did charge a German trench for the bayonet. He was Mad Jack for...
Yeah, and was called Mad Jack.
He was Mad Jack for a reason. So to then play it out as a very traditional narrative of shell-shock as post-traumatic flashbacks in the 1930s semi, and sparked by his brother's, that was in conjunction with the scene about his brother's death, or maybe I'm conflating them a bit. I can't remember.
Yeah, that was only Hamo's death is only just.
Yeah, so it becomes a much more traditional, cliched image of shell shock than I think actually whatever Sassoon suffered was. I think his mental condition was much more complicated, and in many ways historically much more interesting for being so complicated.
And they try to touch on some of that at the end when he's having the discussion with George about not getting a knighthood or the laureateship. And I was waiting for waiting for him to sort of say the Wilfredologists that he, was constantly kind of assailed by. So, there's a way that they kind of missed a trick and sort of coming, if we're going to sort of, top and tail the film, the sort of influence that Owen continued to play on his life and I think his psyche as a poet, because of all the people coming to him. Oh, you knew Owen, as Owen's reputation gets greater and greater as his gets less and less, as it were.
One of the things that I felt a lot whilst watching the film, particularly the bits around Craig Lockhart, sitting there watching it and going, Regeneration was a better film than this. Wouldn't it be nice if I was watching Regeneration at the moment? There's a flippant element to that, but there's also, it's like you're watching it and you're getting the echo of like Jonathan Pryce as W.H. Rivers, and it feels familiar enough to not quite be canny.
I have to say, I love Ben Daniels. I think he was a really good choice to play Rivers, but he's not Jonathan Pryce.
No. I mean, that was the beauty of Regeneration, if we talk about that, really captured the sense of, I'm getting these men well to send them back. I mean, that tortured bit is absolutely superb. Yeah. And I kept thinking, even on the voiceovers of the poetry, you have the flashbacks of that you were talking about, Chris. And I kept coming back to one of my favorites, and it's what got me into the First World War, was Testament of Youth. When Cheryl Campbell, the BBC did that one, the original Testament of Youth filming, and they did a lot of voiceovers of battle or recreated scenes in hospitals and Dulce Decorum Est in particular. And I just kept coming back to that. So I think there's a lot of stuff that kind of has been done before in a sense. And I kept coming back to the stuff I liked, how they'd done it better, I suppose.
Yes.
Which is unfair, I suppose, but
Oh, yeah, but it kind of ties into a little bit about what we were talking about with In Memoriam last week, of that feeling that I've seen this and I've seen this better. And it makes it very difficult to take it on its own terms because it's similar enough to trigger all of the memories of the thing you've already experienced, which you might have enjoyed more.
I think my problem with the archive footage was that it was just bad. It was seemed to be lazily selected. The pictures that they got so there's the photograph from the Great War, the BBC documentary of the guy looking with his 1,000-yard stare, and actually that's just a vignette of a larger photograph with a load of other guys. He's the one guy not smiling, but they used the one picture of the one guy not smiling. I just thought it was really lazy. And then when they did sort of the rostrum camera work on the still images, you're going, well, Ken Burns does this much better. Why? What's the difference? Why? Where are you missing this? Ken Burns does this for a little, and it's fantastic and it's emotive, and this is just sort of flat.
Thinking about our discussion from last month when we were talking about In Memoriam as the regeneration of its generation, but there is a sense with a lot of this material that there's a need to retell these stories. I suppose what we've been struggling with this week, this month and last month is, to some extent, what's new and what's different about the way in which these stories are being told. This is a huge global conflict. There are still, a century on, there are still stories, and we know this as academics because we write these histories and we get our students to write these histories, that there are still so many stories, not that are untold, but that don't get this attention. So what's the point in retelling the stories that we're familiar with, especially in retelling them in the ways that have been done before? And that's where I think I can see the case for They Shall Not Grow Old.
Yeah, I agree.
With all the caveats about it, that it's actually doing something, it's trying to push the boundaries of how we view that footage. Very familiar footage, which is part of the problem, but it is actually trying to get us to look at it again in different ways. And I'm not sure that Benediction is doing enough significantly different to get us to look again at either Sassoon or Owen or any of this coterie. Although if it brings more people to Edith Sitwell's poetry, that can only be a good thing. Long-term
listeners will also know that I have a particular fondness for random stupid cameos. So we've spoken before when they basically do it like basically staring directly at the camera. So we've had it before with Charlie's War when they had a whole thing about Adolf Hitler. But in the time he's just a guy. He's not Adolf Hitler. He's just a person. And that you get an element, you get one of them that I really, really like in Benediction, where they just go like, "It's T. Lawrence, everybody," and then
yes,
and then just move on. It's like, look, he you know him from the place and the time and the stuff, and it's
you're the guy from you're Lawrence of Arabia, and it was just thrown in. I mean, in fact, I did look this up, but he wasn't Sassoon's wife. I was like, did they just throw these people in? But no, he was. But it was so random, and and when they said Lady Sybil, and it's like it was Sybil Colfax. And, you wouldn't know that unless, I only knew her name and I went, yeah, but they'd have called her Lady Colfax, but that's another issue. But yeah, T. Lawrence, that was wonderful.
The things I missed by turning off halfway through.
You missed T. Lawrence, a genuine bona fide random T. Lawrence sighting.
I think this has more to say really about Terence Davies than it really does about Siegfried Sassoon and about himself and how he's viewed his career and relationships as he moves into old age. And he's sort of almost tried to imprint that upon Sassoon's career and life. Terence Davies is an interesting character insofar as he's reportedly from a working class background. If you hear him speak, he's frightfully good RP English, and I think he's packed off to boarding school after his father died. There is not, when you look at the film, it is not particularly a film about class. Or I should say it's all about a certain class. But then you get odd comments such as there's a throwaway remark about, officers just want to be with their men, as they go to one of their lovely upper class soirees. There's not much of the working class brought into it, but there's sort of a hint that they're there in the background somewhere.
doing what working class people do.
Well, and I also think if we're going to think about, sort of class, is that, Owen has a very sort of RP, very quiet, very sort of posh accent. And then they have the throwaway line, almost a throwaway line after his death that he's saying, and Sassoon sort of had said this again. This is probably showing that they'd done the research, where he says, and I thought he had the worst grammar school accent, So even though there would have been a push to sort of speak not in sort of what they would consider lower class sort of accents, he would have had a sort of almost, it's hard to think what kind of accent he would have had, but he grew up in Birkenhead, he lived in Shrewsbury, he wouldn't have had that kind of soft, almost posh accent that he has in the film. So I thought, we're trying to be very imaginative with how he might have spoken. And of course, the only person who sort of talks about tried to remember his voice was Edith Sitwell. But then that's still very romantically discussed. How does one remember across the years what he sounded like? So I thought they kind of, it was just odd. It was odd.
I mean, it's back to your point about the suburban semi, isn't it? That there's almost a flattening of what is understood as upper class in this period. It's very distinctive, and those gradations within the aristocracy, the upper class, the upper middle class, we lose all of that nuance, and it becomes the officer class, which is alongside that point about Sybil Colfax and how she would be referred to. That sort of thing would have been so important to all these people, including Owen within Craig Lockhart, and that point you made right at the beginning about who's wearing what uniform, what they would be wearing. And there was that bizarre scene in the theatre at Craig Lockhart where everybody's in uniform, which I don't think they would have been as patients, except for Sassoon, who's in civvies, and Owen, who's wearing a khaki jacket over civvies. It was really odd.
Just really odd. Yeah, I didn't get any of that. And I guess it is a good question, Jessica. You would know more about that than me, that I had always assumed that they did wear uniform.
So the men of the ranks wear hospital blues. But I'm and I'm going to have to go back and double check this. I'm 95% sure that officers were allowed to wear their own clothes in hospital.
Okay. All right. Which is why they have the thing about the armband, because I thought, well, if you're in uniform, you don't need the armband, right?
And that's getting into the whole, in Dottyville, that section of the memoirs of George Shurston, Sassoon writes about being perceived at, that what he knew about Craig Lockhart before he gets there is that it's where conscientious objectors, there's a camp for the CCF, the NCF rather. That was a little bit of look at all the research we've done, but it's not quite right. but yeah, certainly in hospitals for physical injuries, they did not wear uniform.
Because there is that, I keep thinking about that. There's a illustration on one of the hydras where they have them sort of sitting around in a group. It's a little almost cartoon. And there's one bit that Elizabeth Owen is convinced is actually a sketch of Owen sitting there, and they're in uniform and kind of, so I always had this image in my head. Again, that's my ignorance.
Maybe. I mean, I'm just thinking about sort of what clothes they would have had accessible to them. But if they're in long stay, they could have gotten clothes sent. So the thing about wearing uniform is it's about being under military discipline. And for the men of the ranks, they stay under military discipline even when they're in hospital. But that's not true of officers, because the idea of their relationship to military discipline is different.
But what's interesting, I mean, it got me thinking about Owen's letter to his mother when they do a production of Lucky Durham, and he writes to her and asks him to send cufflinks and bits and pieces so he can have his costume, so he wouldn't have they wouldn't have carried that around. So the fact that, it just tells you how wonderful the postal system was in those days. It's like, could you send me this? And he draws a little sketch of what he needs. And I'm,
In regards to Sassoon's time at Lockhart, as shown in the film, there is actually something that I quite liked at the beginning of the film. I don't want to kind of keep icking it while it's down. As a quick aside, the guy who plays the young Siegfried Sassoon, Jack Loudon, this isn't his fault, but when he laughs and smiles, he looks an awful lot like Simon Pegg in Spaced, and I found that quite distracting. But what I liked about how they open the film is they do the entirety of Sassoon's protest letter, which ordinarily, I mean, it would have been nice if they'd gone a little bit more into what it meant, but the words are there for people to, too often Sassoon gets pigeonholed as basically being, he is anti-war. That's absolutely not the case. Same with Owen. He has very clearly explained his reasons for what he is that he's doing. He wrote it down. It was read out in Parliament that he is, opposed to how the war is now being waged as he foresees it as a war of aggression. And it was nice that they put that in rather than just Siegfried Sassoon didn't like war. Did you know?
And they do go into it a little bit with that first meeting with Rivers, which from my memory of researching Rivers for my MPhil far too many years ago, is actually fairly accurate based on Rivers' recollections of that meeting in terms of discussing what that protest meant. And what Sassoon understood that protest to mean. So that for all the uniforms, I actually quite liked those scenes. I thought that not the one where Rivers explicitly or implicitly implies something about his sexuality, which just wouldn't have been a subject of discussion.
No, well, this is it, and I think this is really what it's about, isn't it? It's about sexuality, and it's about the complexities and the difficulties of being homosexual or gay, if you want to put that term back in that time, that I just think a lot of these conversations wouldn't have happened, right? And that's why I think perhaps why I found that the leave taking scene in particular between Owen and Sassoon was well done, because I think it was more accurate to think about that and understanding between the two of them, but there were all sorts of barriers to that relationship. So I think that was well done, but I think there was a bit more of the sort of, this is how a 21st century person might think that they talked about it.
It's interesting how much we concentrate on the start of the film, or which is actually not the Craig Lockhart scenes don't take much of the film. Now, I just watched the trailer before we sat down, and if you watch the trailer, it's all the Craig Lockhart scenes, and it's a very different film, is the trailer, to the rest of the film. It's interesting what we're pulling out as being the bits that struck us and enjoyed or didn't enjoy, and we engage with more than the rest.
With that in mind, can I say something that might make everybody disagree with me? The Peter Capaldi bits did nothing for me at all. Peter Capaldi is a pretty big name actor, and that whole aspect left me thinking either do this as Siegfried Sassoon as Peter Capaldi looking and root it entirely in that, or do it as Jack Loudon. By doing both, you've made half a film.
Jack Loudon was superb, and I couldn't help but feel that the Peter Capaldi was needed to try and make some sense of the archival footage that gets sort of rammed in as a flashback.
Yeah, it didn't move me at all.
No, and I think it was, if this is about sexuality, to have him in conversation with his son, I think there was a message about the extent to which he was in the closet, or this was ambiguous, or whatever. Yeah, I think that's what. I only because I switched off halfway through, I only got one scene with Peter Capaldi, and it was the conversion scene, which was very sort of high concept metaphorical, with the priest looking through the orb. And
you don't use a censer and that whole big Eucharist thing when you have a baptism. It's fairly mundane.
I kept thinking this is T.S. Eliot at his most high church, isn't it? I don't disagree with you, because I agree with you. I didn't do anything for me.
And I just didn't see the sort of, Jack Loudon is so much prettier than Sassoon was, really, for my money. And then to have him morph into Peter Capaldi as the wizened Sassoon, when did that happen? All of a sudden there's him and having his son, and then it flips to the sort of 60s, and it just didn't. And he was so angry, and I think Sassoon probably was quite angry, but I just found it really, jarring. I didn't think it used Capaldi to his best at all. And they were clearly, like, if you look at I was looking back at pictures of Sassoon in later life, and the sort of cravat and the sort of, very thin, sort of almost wizened look. But yeah, it didn't work.
And that's about the material. It's not about Capaldi's real portrayal or anything like that. There wasn't anything there for me that I think desperately needed to be depicted on screen. At least not like that.
I think it was caricature, and I think that's how I kind of felt, was that, even the Sitwell, the Adeline Morel, Ivor Novello, all of those folks were caricatures. And okay, you don't have that much time in a film to develop character, but that's the mark of a good film, isn't it? And also, it was way too long. I think they could have used the very, very pregnant pauses to have developed character rather than just have people sit in silence and look at each other, kind of like a Pinter play.
Yeah, I mean, you said, character, okay, you don't have that much time to do things. It's like, well, considering how they spent some of their time, I reckon they probably did.
Does Capaldi need to be there, though, in some respect, to show how bitter he is about, I guess, not so much about the war, about his relationships? Is that not why you have to have that later Sassoon in? But you could have just slot him in at the end.
Well, I mean, I think the later Sassoon is interesting. I could see why they wanted to do the sort of then and now kind of back and forth, but it just didn't gel. And I think that's the thing we were saying about, we weren't sure whether we were in the 20s or the 30s, or we were in the war, or we were out of the war. I think there was a way to have done that quite interestingly. And so much about Sassoon really is that afterlife. That's the story that hasn't been told about Sassoon. We know, like you said, that the hook to get people to see this is the Craig Lockhart bit. But actually, I think it wants to tell the story of Sassoon's post-war life, which is interesting in the way that he clashed with the modernists and felt himself out of the sort of literary world, but sort of in it. And all of, and his sense about his poetry, the comment that, he kind of stopped writing poetry in 1919, I think there was a very interesting life story there to be told, but it didn't do it. We just got caricatures.
And it's almost like there's too much time in there. But I'm also sitting here looking at the cast list. There were just too many people. Even as someone who's really quite familiar with all of the characters involved, it was really hard to get a grip on who was supposed to be who, what their relationships were. And it almost would have worked better as a series of two-handers, because one of the things that I think did work well about the Peter Capaldi scene was when he was just talking to his son before they brought the priest in, and a space in which to demonstrate, here is an angry old man. That comes across from the beginning of that scene. And then you could do it in flashback of, Sassoon with Owen, Sassoon with Rivers, Sassoon with Robbie Ross. Those key pairings. But when you get the big party scenes and suddenly Sybil Colfax drifts across the screen, we keep going back to her, or T. Lawrence pops up and you suddenly go, oh, yeah.
I just love that.
I think there's a good film desperately trying to get out of this. And I think that probably Terence Davies needed to be removed from the room, and a really good editor with some big balls to come in and sit there and really hammer it out and go through it all and rejiggle it all and perhaps drop the flashback because it ends up being good. And I think there's probably a really or a better film.
It's interesting the extent, as it is at the moment, the extent to which the film outsources a lot of the gap filling to the audience, because it doesn't fill them in itself. It relies on the audience to be able to understand what is happening, who these people are, and fill in the gaps, because it doesn't really attempt to do it itself, which places quite the burden on the audience, and either leaves a chunk of the audience who've got no idea who any of these people are, understandably has no idea who any of these people are, or people like us who go, wasn't like that.
It's a misreading of the audience, isn't it?
Yes, exactly.
Well, I think the audience is Terence Davies, and it's made for him, and he understands it, and I'm not sure that anybody else could really quite grapple with it in the same, or interact with it in the same way. There's too much going on that we're not seeing. I'm sure we're picking up on bits that other people from different backgrounds will go, oh, no, I didn't see that at all, and picking up, it's just bizarre. Now, why are we wrong? You know, this film has rave reviews. I was going through the reviews. Everybody loves it. Well, Chris, you wrote your review for
History Extra.
Did you give it a rave review?
I did not.
So everybody in the media loves it, but Chris,
I mean, I gave it a polite review, which is different.
Well, it's a little bit back to In Memoriam, right? Everybody on Instagram adores it.
I was going to say, you mentioned that last, and I listened to that, and I looked at reviews of it, but it's the same for some of Pat Barker's novels. You know, her later ones post the Regeneration trilogy, which, you know, I think, Jessica, you said in reading In Memoriam, it's like, I've read this before. And indeed, you know, Barker says these are the sort of things that, you know, she has it in the afterwards. You might like to look at these things. And I think but it got, you know, Life Class and other things got really great reviews for its sort of searing portrayal of nursing and aftermath. And I went, well, that stuff came out during the war and I've read it.
Yeah, I think this, and again, similar to In Memoriam, there's a comforting familiarity to it that borders on fan service. There's an element of, did you like Regeneration? Did you like the book and the film? Have something that's very similar and you'll love it. But, well, but I've seen that. Is the issue that I think where we are dividing away from kind of some of the mainstream critics. And you know, it's a good-looking film.
It's sort of a trend that makes me a little bit anxious, and this happened during the centenary as well. You know, as a historian because we're constantly told, you know, you need to come up with a new angle, you need to do something new, you can't do what you've done before, you've got to tell a new story. What's the untold story of the war, that marketing trope? And yet cultural production is geared towards telling the same stories in the same way over again, to the point of perpetuating myth, to the point of not, you know, and revisionist becomes a dirty word, that you can't make the argument that Sassoon's shell shock is not the same as everybody's representation of shell shock, that it might be different and it might involve violence and hatred of the enemy and critique of the way the war is being run rather than a pacifist narrative. But that doesn't sell. So there's a disjuncture between what we're told as historians we're supposed to be doing and what cultural production is doing, which is someone who sort of is trying to have a foot in both camps makes me really uncomfortable.
Interesting you say it doesn't sell. If the Wikipedia figures are anything to go by, this doesn't sell either. Now, I'm sure they'll make the money back a bit more on Netflix and it'll balance the books. But, you know, they are, you know, going over the same old tropes.
It's sold to the critics.
It's sold to the critics. And then there is something in that, you know, it's like, well, there's that thing, if you sell too much, if you are Dan Brown, you don't have the art. But, you know, the fact that it hasn't made loads and it's not a blockbuster, it's an art film and it comes into its own, right? So therefore it is much more high art. But I think it you know, it is sort of playing to what the not just the sort of what cultural production wants, but cultural memory wants, right? Or revision idea of what cultural memory was then. And it is difficult to buck those trends.
And then we're back to Brian Bond's critique of, well, where's the military history in the cultural histories of the war? How do you meld, you know, rigorous history with creative representation? And films like this have me going, I just don't know.
I think they can be done right. And I think I watched it suspending disbelief. You know, you have to do that because everybody's interpretation is going to be different. And it's like, you know, a poem, right? It isn't the military history. It's an artistic rendering that is meant to make you think and to refashion and to do all those things that, you know, I would say as a literary historian. But at the same time, I also am enough of a historian to go, you could get the stuff right. Okay, there's poetic license, but then there's just either laziness or just willful, I don't think it matters. Well, it does matter, actually. Anybody's interpretation of Owen is going to be different because anybody that knew him is dead. We can only know him through the poetry, through the letters, and our own impression. And my impression of him will be different than somebody else's, right? And nobody owns that image. So I'm quite happy to see how other people interpret him or interpret Sassoon. But I think those details that we mentioned that just are incorrect, right? That aren't open to interpretation, right?
And it is possible to go too far the other way. There is the train spotter school of history that goes, that uniform cap badge is wrong, therefore this film is rubbish.
Well, exactly. I was going to say, that gun isn't the right caliber.
Though from the train spotting perspective, there is a wonderful throwaway line when he goes to his tailor's and he asks him, "What green do you want?"
Yes.
And I thought it was wonderful because sort of you get that whole sort of military modeler sort of, it's the wrong colour green. It should be a slightly different shade, and it doesn't really work. But I thought that was a wonderful little line.
It's like the Father Ted thing. No, it's not. That's just very, very, very dark blue. Black. Yeah.
I think the recommendation is if you're thinking about watching Benediction, watch Regeneration instead.
So I always say I think our general impressions is that we weren't particularly favourable to it.
Although if you want to hear a good reading of Disabled in some of the poems, I think they could. I mean, I wouldn't mind having a CD of Jack Loudon doing the readings. That would be great.
The acting, can I just say, I mean, for all the critique of, Ben Daniels not being Jonathan Pryce, the acting really was very good. Okay, not who played Ivor Novello, which was, that was caricature, but I think it was written that way. But, this is a roster of superb actors doing what they do really well, actually, with just some perhaps not very good material.
Yeah, I think our critique is of the material rather than the presentation of it.
Oh, absolutely.
It genuinely looks fantastic, doesn't it? I mean, it looks all,
in the way it looks.
Yeah, it's a lovely film. As I said, just what's about an hour lopping off, and someone really to hack at it and take it to bits.
Yes, that's what I felt. I found watching it that actually this could be 45 minutes to an hour shorter and be actually quite a poignant film. But I found myself, and I study this stuff, and I'm going, okay, I'm a little bored now.
I have chloroformed my sense of disbelief.
But I will say, I did stay through the credits because I was interested to see how they credited things, and Owen's out of copyright, so that just says by Wilfred Owen. But it was nice to see at the very end Catherine Walker noted as a special thanks. Who, sadly she passed away, but she is, I think she deserves a little mention here as being the real driving force behind the War Poets collection at Craig Lockhart. So I was really pleased that they had put her name on that list, even though it's quite at the very end. So
I thought when you were talking about the credits, you were going to say there's an after credits sequence like in a superhero film, and it's he was going to set up a rousing sequel.
Well, I sat through them in the cinema just to see that she had been credited. But that's the Anorak thing I do, really. But yeah, it would have been fun if they'd had the outtakes. Would have been interesting. Wonder what those were like.
I've just realised that by turning off halfway through, I missed Anton Lesser as the older Stephen Tennant.
Oh gosh, yes. I found it difficult to find Stephen Tennant actually turning up at a 30 semi. Really,
I struggle to disassociate him from the character that he plays in Game of Thrones and then later Andor. It was very, very jarring for me. The performance is great, but
I've been watching him first in Endeavour, and
me too,
and then in Better, that the BBC short series set in Leeds, which is why I watch it with Andrew Buchan as a crime kingpin, and Anton Lesser is a old corrupt cop. He's fabulous in that. So I've got him in my head as sort of northern cop at the moment.
And of course, I just watched Slow Horses, and Jack Loudon's in that. So actually, when I went to rewatch Regeneration, Benediction, I thought, oh, Cartwright.
I will have to watch Slow Horses now. I did like Jack Loudon. I thought he was very good.
So as we've creeping over the hour, shall we sort of wrap things up? Chris, I'm not sure we know what we're doing next time out, do we?
I don't think we have any idea. I think we've got ideas, but we're going to take a break at some point because of holidays and the like. Or I know that we're all going to Canada, where the Canadians are, for
well, that's going to have to be our October episode. So we've got a couple to go because we had a summer holiday earlier, didn't we?
That's true.
We did have it. Yes. Scheduling problems.
So it'll be about something, presumably. There must be other things.
First World War will appear somewhere.
Yeah. I know we had a long list and my mind has gone blank on what that list was.
We've got various games to play.
We do have various games to play.
We could try the Grizzled.
Grizzled could be fun. We also need to line up our Halloween episode and start thinking about Christmas with Mark Connolly at some point, because...
Oh, I know what we were going to do. We were going to see if we could do the young Indiana Jones for the start of the school year.
That would be great.
There we go. And I've seen the new Indiana Jones
that's
film
right.
as well.
You said that. Yeah. Excellent.
Yeah, it's very good fun. That's all I wanted it to be. Very good fun, and it's very good fun.
Fantastic. Well, as the school holidays are upon us, I can now try and persuade my daughter to sit and watch young Indiana Jones.
I will watch with my son because he's been to see the Indiana Jones film. I have not. Am
I the only one here that remembers seeing the Indiana Jones when it first came out?
I wasn't allowed to go in. It was a PG, and my friend went, who is the year above me at school, and I couldn't get in.
Oh God, I'm so old.
I really wanted to go. That and Clash of the Titans, which came out at the same time, I never got to see. My friend Martin went to see it because he was in the year above me, and they believed he was a PG and I wasn't. Lovely. Well, with that, thank you everybody. Lovely to chat. Good luck to anybody who managed to slog all the way through Benediction.
Thank you. Good fun.
and hopefully when we talk about Indiana Jones, we will get back onto things that we love about cultural representations of the First World War.
Yeah, indeed. Right?
Yeah, I think so.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.